The story of the silent passenger. Everything took place in a small American town surrounded by dark and dense forests. The silent passenger. It started as a routine drive for James, a rideshare driver in a quiet suburban town. He worked the late shift, picking up passengers who preferred to avoid busier hours. Tonight seemed no different, until the notification for his next pickup appeared. The address wasn't one he recognized. It was outside of town, near the old highway that wound through an abandoned stretch of countryside. James hesitated. That area was nearly deserted, but curiosity won over. He figured it might just be someone stranded or needing a ride home from a late-night job. The GPS led him to a crumbling, overgrown driveway. The house, barely visible in the dim glow of his headlights, was clearly uninhabited, windows boarded up, the roof sagging. James glanced at the app. The passenger's name was listed as Eli, but there was no sign of anyone waiting. Feeling uneasy, he honked his horn lightly, hoping someone would emerge. A figure stepped out of the shadows. The man, or at least James thought it was a man, moved stiffly, almost unnaturally. He was tall, his face hidden under the brim of an old-fashioned hat. James rolled down the passenger window. "You Eli?" he called out. The figure nodded slowly but said nothing. James shrugged, unlocking the doors. He figured maybe the guy was just shy or tired. The passenger climbed in and settled into the back seat directly behind James. That was strange. Most people sat on the passenger side if they were alone. "Where to?" James asked, glancing in the rearview mirror. The man didn't respond. Instead, he reached into his pocket and handed James a crumpled piece of paper. It had an address scribbled on it, somewhere James didn't recognize. He input it into the GPS. 45 minutes away, heading deeper into the countryside. "All right, long drive," James muttered, trying to lighten the mood. But the man said nothing. As James drove, the silence in the car grew oppressive. The air felt heavy, and an unsettling feeling crept over him. Every so often he glanced in the mirror, but the passenger sat perfectly still, his face obscured by the shadow of his hat. Then, James noticed something odd. The man wasn't breathing, at least not that James could tell. His chest didn't rise or fall. James brushed it off as paranoia. The guy was probably just really still. 20 minutes into the drive, James's phone buzzed with a message from the rideshare app. Drop-off location updated. He checked the new address. It was even deeper into the woods, on a road that barely showed up on the GPS. "Hey, your address changed," James said, glancing in the mirror. "Is that right?" The passenger didn't respond. James felt his skin prickle. The man's reflection in the mirror seemed wrong. Something about it didn't match the angle of his head. James gripped the wheel tighter. "All right, no problem," he muttered, trying to keep his voice steady. The road grew narrower and darker as they drove. Trees loomed on either side, their gnarled branches casting eerie shadows across the windshield. James turned on his high beams, but they did little to pierce the darkness. Suddenly, his phone buzzed again. Another update. "Passenger has canceled the ride." James frowned. Canceled? That didn't make sense. He was still driving the guy. He glanced in the rearview mirror, and his stomach dropped. The back seat was empty. James slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt. Heart pounding, he twisted around to look into the back seat. Nothing. The passenger was gone. The door hadn't opened. He hadn't heard a sound. Adrenaline surged through him. He grabbed his phone, intending to call anyone, but the screen wouldn't unlock. It flickered, the display glitching with static. Then a faint whisper came from the back seat. "Keep driving." James froze. The voice was barely audible, but it sent chills down his spine. Slowly, he turned back toward the front. His hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel. I don't know what's going on, but I'm done," James stammered. He put the car into reverse, ready to turn around and head back to town. But as he looked out the rear window, he saw them. Figures. Dozens of them, standing silently on the road behind him. Their faces were indistinct, blurred, like smudges on a photograph. All of them were staring at his car. Panicked, James shifted back into drive and hit the gas, speeding forward. The road twisted and turned, but he didn't care. He just needed to get away. The GPS was still running, directing him toward the original destination. Against his better judgment, he followed it, desperate for any sign of civilization. The road ended abruptly in front of a clearing. His headlights illuminated an old cemetery. The gravestones cracked and weathered. James's phone buzzed again. The rideshare app flashed a notification. "You have arrived at your destination." "No," James whispered. "No, no, no." The whisper came again, louder this time. "Look in the mirror." James didn't want to, but his body moved on its own. Slowly he raised his eyes to the rearview mirror. The passenger was back, seated behind him, his hat now tipped back just enough to reveal hollow, empty sockets where eyes should have been. His mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. "You're here," the man rasped. The car's engine died, and the headlights flickered out, plunging James into darkness. The next morning, authorities found James's car abandoned in the clearing. The doors were locked, the keys still in the ignition. Of James himself, there was no trace. Only a single crumpled piece of paper left on the driver's seat, with one word scrawled in shaky handwriting. Days passed, and the story of James's disappearance quickly spread through the town. People whispered about the strange circumstances, but no one had answers. The police conducted their investigations, but the only clue they had was the single word written on the paper: Eli. Some dismissed it as a hoax. Others speculated about foul play. But for Clara, James's younger sister, it wasn't just a mystery. It was personal. She couldn't accept that her brother had simply vanished without a trace. Determined to find the truth, Clara decided to retrace James's steps. Clara worked at a local diner, and she knew James's routine well. Late one evening, after her shift ended, she borrowed his old rideshare account credentials and logged in. She scrolled through his ride history, her heart sinking as she saw the final trip he'd taken. The destination, a cemetery far outside town, sent a chill down her spine. Clara hesitated for a moment before taking a deep breath. "I have to know what happened," she thought. With James's phone in hand, she set off into the night. The road was darker than Clara expected. Trees seemed to lean in, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The air grew colder the further she drove, and an unnatural silence settled over the area. Even the hum of the car engine seemed muted. She reached the spot where James had picked up his mysterious passenger. The house was just as he'd described, boarded up, forgotten. But Clara didn't stop. Instead, she drove on, following the same route James had taken, her GPS guiding her deeper into the woods. As she approached the cemetery, Clara's phone buzzed. Her heart raced as she glanced down at the screen. It was a rideshare notification, but there was no destination, no name, only 2 words: pickup. A chill ran down her spine. She slowed the car, scanning the road ahead. That's when she saw him. A figure stood at the edge of the road, wearing the same wide-brimmed hat James had described. Clara's knuckles whitened as she gripped the steering wheel. The man didn't wave or approach the car. He simply stared at her, his face obscured by shadow. Clara's first instinct was to drive away, but then she thought of James. Swallowing her fear, she rolled down the passenger side window. "Are you Eli?" she asked, her voice trembling. The figure nodded once, slowly, then walked around to the back door and climbed in. Clara's stomach churned as the door clicked shut. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The passenger handed her a crumpled piece of paper, just as James had described. Clara unfolded it, her hands shaking. The address wasn't far. It was the cemetery. She glanced in the mirror, but the man's face was still hidden under the brim of his hat. "I don't know what's going on, but I'm not afraid of you," Clara said, more to herself than to him. The passenger didn't respond. She drove toward the cemetery, her heart pounding with every mile. The road seemed to stretch on forever, the trees on either side growing denser almost as if they were closing in. When the cemetery finally came into view, Clara's headlights illuminated the same cracked and moss-covered gravestones. The air grew colder, and Clara's breath fogged up the windshield. Her phone buzzed again. The notification read, "You have arrived at your destination." Clara turned to confront the passenger, but the back seat was empty. Her heart sank. She stepped out of the car, clutching the piece of paper tightly. The cemetery was eerily quiet, and a thick mist swirled around the gravestones. Clara wandered between the graves, her flashlight casting long, jittery shadows. She called out, "James, are you here?" Her voice echoed back to her, swallowed by the mist. She approached a large, weathered gravestone that seemed older than the others. The name etched into it sent a chill down her spine. Eli Hargrove. The dates suggested he had died over a century ago. Suddenly, the air grew heavier. Clara turned and her flashlight flickered. Figures began to emerge from the mist, silent, motionless shapes standing between the gravestones. Their faces were blurred, just as James had described. They watched her, their heads tilting unnaturally. "Where is my brother?" Clara demanded, her voice trembling but defiant. The figures didn't move, but the shadows around her seemed to grow deeper. A faint whisper drifted through the air. "He's here." Clara turned back to the gravestone. The name James Cartwright had appeared beneath Eli's, freshly etched into the stone. Her stomach churned as the whispering grew louder, surrounding her. "Join him," the voices chanted in unison. Clara stumbled backward, dropping her flashlight. Panic surged through her as the figures began to close in. She bolted for the car, her feet slipping on the damp ground. She could hear footsteps behind her, slow, deliberate. Clara reached the car and yanked the door open, slamming it shut behind her. She fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking as she started the engine. The headlights flared to life, illuminating the road ahead. But when she looked up, the passenger was back in the rearview mirror. His face was no longer hidden. It was gaunt, hollow, with empty black sockets for eyes and a twisted grin that stretched too wide. "You can't leave," he rasped. The car wouldn't move. No matter how hard Clara pressed the gas pedal, the engine roared uselessly. The passenger leaned closer, his voice filling the car like a low rumble. "You're part of this now." The last thing Clara saw was the cemetery fading into darkness as the figures surrounded the car. The next morning, her car was found parked in the same clearing where James's had been. The engine was cold, and the doors were locked. On the dashboard was a single piece of paper with one word scrawled in Clara's handwriting. "Help." Clara awoke, a biting cold seeping into her bones. She was still in the car, but everything was enveloped in absolute darkness. The headlights, her phone, everything was dead. Her breathing quickened as she noticed the driver's side window was rolled down. Outside, the shadowy figures still stood, silently watching her. They didn't move, but their unrelenting stillness made her hands tremble. Suddenly, a familiar figure appeared through the gravestones. It was James. His face was pale, his eyes hollow like the passenger's. He was staring right at her. "James?" Clara croaked, opening the car door. "Is that you? Say something." But instead of responding, James raised his hand and pointed toward the gravestone he was standing beside. Clara hesitated but stepped out of the car on unsteady legs, slowly approaching him. The headstone now bore a chilling sight. Beneath the names Eli Hargrove and James Cartwright was a fresh engraving. Clara Cartwright. Her breath caught in her throat. The mist around her thickened and the shadowy figures began to move, closing in on her. "This isn't real," she screamed. "I'm still alive." But James, still staring at her, finally spoke, his voice low and emotionless. "You came for me. But now you stay. No one leaves." The figures reached her, their icy touch gripping her shoulders. Clara screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the rising tide of whispers that drowned out everything around her. The next morning, Clara's car was found parked on the roadside, not far from the cemetery. The doors were wide open, the battery drained, and her phone lay on the driver's seat. On the screen was an unsent message. "He's here, it's a trap." Her body was never found. However, some locals later claimed to have seen Clara wandering near the cemetery. She was standing among the graves, pale and motionless, her empty gaze fixed as though guarding something or someone. Since then, the cemetery has become a place no one dares to visit even in daylight.